Now, what do I mean by the strange death of American grand strategy? To simplify rather a lot, because I've only got a short time, to simplify rather a lot, the United States doesn't have a grand strategy tradition like European countries and large empires in non-European areas have had. European countries live life as if on a life and death chessboard, where every move by every power in the balance of power system, let's talk about the modern balance of power systems after Westphalia, implicated every other power's interests and prospects. And so there was a lot of formal thinking, calculation, deliberation, planning when it came to statecraft. And statecraft is not the same, by the way, as diplomacy. Diplomacy is how you organize yourself to deal with other countries in tacit bargaining situations. But statecraft, which is often used as a synonym for diplomacy, is something more than that. It is the art of concording domestic and external interests and concerns. So that, for example, when a statesman, a real statesman, is thinking about can I afford to, let's say hypothetically, can I afford to get the United States involved in a long-term babysitting operation in Syria? What's the trade-off with the cost of that with regard to domestic issues? So it's balancing and concording domestic concerns and interests with global. That's what statecraft is. Diplomacy is a subset of statecraft. So I would urge all of you not to use these words as synonyms anymore because they're not. We don't have in this country, as I say, a sort of formal grand strategy tradition that is Clausewitzian, that's European. The country did in the early going to some extent, because whereas now we are used to essentially inhabiting most of the North American continent from Atlantic to Pacific and so forth. Back then, there were still powerful European empires right next to the young United States. So it's not true that the Washington administration and the Adams administration, the Jefferson administration were oblivious to these kinds of concerns. But over time, those concerns became less pressing, and we've really only had two grand strategies in the entire history of the Republic, as best I can tell. The first one was simply, and by the way, apropos of what a grand strategy is. A grand strategy is simple. If it isn't simple, it isn't grand. It has to be extraordinarily parsimonious in order to communicate the basic message that a leader needs to communicate, to organize his coterie to do what he wants them to do. So that, just to give you an example, after December 7th, 1941, American grand strategy for the duration of the Second World War was so simple and so succinct and so concentrated that it could be expressed in just two words. The strategy was Europe first. Right? So you get the idea. These things have to be parsimonious and they have to be little bite-sized nuggets of language. So we've really only had two grand strategies. The first one, starting from the commencement of the country, really to the closing of the frontier, Frederick Jackson Turner moment in American history, was very simple. It was grab the continent. Seize as much of the North American continent as you could. That was Jefferson's Empire of Liberty. By some locutions, it was Manifest Destiny, of course, by other locutions. But that was basically it. Get to the Pacific, and then sort of consolidate everything in between. And of course, sometimes it got a little out of hand in the execution of this first grand strategy. President Madison catalyzed a war with Britain in 1812. We burnt down York, which is today, I think, Toronto. Of course, everybody knows that the British burned down the White House, burned down Washington, was it 1814, 1813? But few Americans are ever told we started this by burning down Toronto. But anyway, never mind. That wasn't a very smart thing to do. We eventually gave up trying to consolidate and bring Canada into the United States. Then there were these meanderings right around the time of the Spanish-American War into Cuba and areas in the Caribbean. But basically, we got the continent, and we got it by hook or by crook. I mean, you could make a case, if you wanted to, that the Mexican War, 1848, 1849, was pretty much a war of pure aggression on the part of the United States. But as Machiavelli says, every benign political order has some kind of criminal antecedent. And now that it's the 500th anniversary of the publication of The Prince, I think it's okay to mention Machiavelli in polite company. So however it happened, the first grand strategy of the United States, get the continent, worked. We did it. Worked. Then what happened? Well, again, to simplify remarkably and overwhelmingly, because I'm speaking here mostly about geostrategy and geopolitics. And American strategy has never been exclusively about geopolitics and geomilitary kinds of concerns. That's always been the plinth, I think. But there's always been an economic dimension to American grand strategy, which has changed some over time. There's always been an ideological dimension to American grand strategy, the spread of democracy, a spread of, in more recent times, human rights and so on and so forth. But I really do think that the plinth of it still, I guess I'm a little old-fashioned, though it's gotten much more complex, is still geopolitics. It's still military strength, where it is, who has it. It's still the ultima ratio in international relations, as best I can tell. Though again, it's gotten much more complex in the last 30, 40 years. So what was the second grand strategy of the United States? The second grand strategy of the United States was really promulgated, was thunk through, as we say, by Alfred Thayer Mahan. Truly a pivotal figure in American historical thinking. And it's very simple to express. No hegemons, except us. All right? Basic idea was no hegemon in peninsular Europe, no hegemon in East Asia. So that American policy would be devoted to preventing a hegemon from arising on either bracket of Eurasia. That was it. Again, remember, these have to be simple in order to be useful. Why? Well, there were two reasons, really, that dovetailed one another. The first was the United States being across big oceans was fairly protected. It was a world island in Mackinder's geopolitical vision of things. But we could still be vulnerable to invasion or to physical harm if any military power on either side, across either ocean, were powerful enough to be able to come and do harm to the United States. That was the idea. But the other reason, which I think is probably more important, was that back in those days the view was not only did we not want to fight wars with hegemons, which by the way could also interrupt international trade and could harm us economically, but we didn't want to have to mobilize ourselves militarily in such a way that we would eventually prove untrue to the principles of a small Jeffersonian government. We didn't want to have a large army. We didn't want to have a large. That was not everybody, of course, was of this view, but this was the mainstream view. One of the reasons for preventing hegemons was that we wouldn't have to mobilize against them and stay mobilized and thus be untrue to our principles. So, how are we to implement this grand strategy of no hegemons? Well, in the period after the Spanish-American War, after Mahan was writing, we basically did it in the wake of the Royal Navy. The Royal Navy, the British Navy, essentially controlled the seas, and the American grand strategy partnered, in a way, with Britain. Of course, we had our own capabilities rising. You remember that President Roosevelt, the first Roosevelt, Teddy Roosevelt, sent the Great White Fleet, as it was called, around the world. I think it was in 1905. Somebody will correct me if I got the year wrong here or there. So we were flexing our muscles. We were becoming an industrial power. We took Panama from Colombia and built the canal, which was the greatest engineering feat of its day. We were clearly flexing our muscles, but it was an anti-hegemonic strategy that was basically riding along with the power of the Royal Navy, moving right along very fast through history. And then comes Pearl Harbor, comes World War II, and we find ourselves. Oh, by the way, I forgot to mention, as I said, after the Spanish-American War, the first real projection of American power into brackets of Eurasia, in this case the Asian bracket of Eurasia, was with the annexation of the Philippines, which was probably one of the stupidest things that any major power in the 20th century or the end of the 19th ever did. And even President Roosevelt, who at first thought this was a bully thing to do, very quickly realized what a strategic error the annexation of the Philippines was. And of course, this proved to be true in 1941, 1942. We'll come back to the Philippines in a minute. But that was the first extension of the anti-hegemon strategy offshore, off the United States, unless you want to count Hawaii, which is a special case in our history. After World War II, of course, we found ourselves with American soldiers at the brackets of Eurasia. We found American soldiers in occupation of several countries in Western Europe. We found American soldiers in occupation of Japan, parts of Korea. And so the strategy didn't change, all right? No hegemons. No hegemon in East Asia, no hegemon in peninsular Europe, but the modality changed, and the modality became one of forward deployment. The idea was, basically, as it developed, that the United States would prevent the rise of hegemons by being physically present, not dominant, but being physically present on the brackets of Eurasia, so that we would be able to, and our Navy especially, and then later our Air Force, was the ante that we paid to play in this game of geopolitics, regional geopolitics, in Europe and in East Asia. And the purpose of it was to suppress security competitions. Let me repeat that, it's very important. To suppress security competitions in those regions so as to prevent a click-clack mousetrap dynamic that could ultimately produce a hegemon that could threaten the United States. Now, of course, after World War II, the imperative to prevent the hegemon in Peninsular Europe and the imperative to prevent the hegemon in East Asia fell into the ideological mantra of the Cold War. It was clear who these potential hegemons could be. It was the Soviet Union in Peninsular Europe, and after 1949, it was China in East Asia. So the development of international communism and the role of World War II in creating the bipolar circumstances of the Cold War fit right into this grand strategic notion that we had. We now had proper names to put essentially on the map as to who these hegemons we were trying to prevent were. Now, of course, we weren't anti-hegemonic by principle. We only were anti-hegemonic when it came to other countries. We were perfectly happy to be the hegemon of the Western Hemisphere. So it's not an anti-hegemonic strategy. It's just we don't like other people to be hegemons, right? Now, you might say this is selfish. This is hypocritical. Whatever. It's just the way that national security strategy and these kinds of things tend to go. You know, we always want mercy for ourselves from the Holy One, blessed be He, but we want justice for our adversaries. It never occurs to us that we should want mercy for our adversaries and justice for ourselves. That's just human nature, like it or not. So we created this second modality to our second grand strategy in our history, forward deployment. That's how we would suppress security competitions, and that's how we would prevent hegemonic threats to the United States. As I say, we use the Navy, we use later the Air Force, mainly as the modalities, the military modalities, and of course, there were many other things that we did from the point of view of the economic policy, and as I say, the ideological dimension of our strategy that went along with this. And of course, in the second phase, the second part, after World War II, we actually created formal alliance structures to seal in this forward deployed strategy. We created NATO, we created a series of alliance structures in Asia, some of which survived the Vietnam era, some of which did not. And these were the modalities, these were the political modalities through which we managed these alliance structures, again, for the purpose of preventing hegemons via forward deployment. And of course, the result of it was an international military footprint for the United States that spanned practically the entire globe. Later on in the post-World War II period, Cold War period, the Middle East began to play a more prominent role in this whole business. The Carter Doctrine dates from 1977, right? 79, 70, I don't know. In the 70s. It's a long time ago, we don't have to worry about it, you weren't born. But the Middle East was seen as a subordinate strategic concern in those days, for the most part. It was really the energy, the rise of oil as the main driver of the international economy that persuaded most American thinkers, strategic thinkers, that it was the key to Europe's recovery from the war and then in European prosperity, and that it was also part of the underpinning of the European unification movement, the European Union movement, so that the Middle East became important secondarily as an adjunct to the anti-hegemonic strategy with regard to Western Europe. The Middle East later acquired significance of its own, but I don't want to go into that. We don't have time for it. So then, what happened? So where did the strange death come from? Now, it's taken me about 3 minutes, I guess, to articulate what the grand strategy of the United States is today, and what it's been really since 1946, 47. It's very simple. It's an anti-hegemonic strategy, the modality of which is forward deployment. And the purpose is to suppress security competitions in these brackets of Eurasia so that no hegemon arises that can threaten us. That's it. How long did that take? That's about less than 60 seconds. If you get out of Capitol Hill today, and you ask senators and congressmen, or you ask the staffers, to tell you, say, what is the grand strategy of the United States, you will get lots of funny answers, many of them drawn out, but you won't hear that. This is the 600-pound gorilla in the room. We've been doing this for so many years, and it's become so second nature that we've forgotten why we're doing it, and our political class is no longer capable of articulating it in any kind of simple or lucid fashion. It's sad, but or it's not. I don't know. Whatever it is, it's just the way it is. Okay. So now what's happened? So along comes 911. I'm really going. I'm skipping faster. I apologize, but there's no way to do this in 20 minutes. Along comes 911, and what happens? The Bush administration panics, basically. It starts saying things that, well, look, American foreign policy is like a sine wave. It goes all the way back to 1812. It's a four-part cycle, all right? First, there is a shock to the system, an unexpected shock to the system. The sinking of the Maine and Havana Harbor counts. Actually, in a funny way, sui generis way, they shot at Fort Sumter in 1860, that counts. The Zimmerman telegram and the sinking of the Lusitania, that counts. Pearl Harbor, 911. There have been some of these sort of specific points of shock, external shock. And it shocks us because we believe that we are entitled to absolute security in the United States. We don't live like Asians and Europeans have lived for centuries. We believe that we are entitled to absolute security. That's simply a function of our geography. We have a very nice but rather feckless neighbor to the north. We have a slightly feckless and dysfunctional neighbor to the south. And to the east and west, we have a lot of fish. Okay? So we've gotten used to this since the burning of the White House in 1813, or 1814, I forget the year. I was there, but I can't remember. We've gotten used to this idea of absolute security. So along comes 911. There hadn't been an attack on American soil, either since Pearl Harbor, if you count Hawaii as American, or since 1812. So the Bush administration kind of panicked. Everybody in the administration, except the person I work for, kind of like lost their bearings and began to say things like everything has changed, which was simply not true. Everything could change if we persuaded ourselves that everything had changed, and then we proceeded to do a lot of dumb things, which we did. But so suddenly, people were saying, well, NATO is obsolete. All the institutions that we had created and all of the relationships that we had built, that we had nurtured for 50 years, suddenly in the minds of some people, were not only part of the solution, but they were part of the problem. And we had to start from scratch. And this was a form of kind of pseudo-heroic panic that struck many of the senior people in the Bush administration. And we ended up, willy-nilly, let me not go into details unless you want later, we ended up fighting 2 land wars in Asia Minor, in 2 of the hardest-asked countries in the world, Afghanistan and Iraq, all right? And they're hard-asked for reasons that require your knowledge of the Middle East or of this part of the world, and if you don't have it, you're not alone. The learning curve in this country since 9/11 has been approximately flat, as best I can tell. No one's taken the slightest interest in this part of the world. It's a little like, it reminds me of Vietnam in a way. You know, we spent, I don't know how many years, and how many, 50,000 lives and so forth, and we still couldn't summon any curiosity about this country's history or culture or language, even after the whole damn thing had played through. Pretty amazing. But don't forget, I mean, this is America. And America is the only country in the history of the world, the only society in the history of the world where when you say that's history, you mean that's irrelevant. So what do? We spent 10 years. We're still pulling ourselves out of Afghanistan with our red, white, blue tail between our legs. That's what it's going to look like in the end. And we spent a huge freaking amount of money. The defense budget, if you look at it in either nominal or inflation-adjusted terms, practically doubled from 9/11 until sequestration, until recently. Now, almost all of that money went to fighting these wars. Very little of it went into acquisition. Very little of it went into research. Very little of it, it went into the personnel accounts. It went into the O&M operations and maintenance accounts. It was basically, I mean, insofar as you think that our deficit is a function of the military budget, I think that's exaggerated for the most part. But to the extent that it's true, it's because of these wars. And where did that money go? That money went mainly to the Army, and to some extent to the Marines. And the Army did a great job adjusting and figuring out how to spend that money. It took them a while, but they figured it out. They're still kind of in the haze of the counterinsurgency mist, which is a problematical thing. The lead article in the current issue, Modern Warfare, talks about the counterinsurgency cult. But if you're thinking in terms of grand strategy, all right, you don't spend all this money on the Army and the Marines. Remember, the instruments of our grand strategy are our Navy and our Air Force. What did we do for the past 10, 11 years? We starved the Navy and we starved the Air Force. The Air Force is grotesquely undercapitalized right now. The Navy is small and getting smaller. If sequestration continues, and it probably will, we're talking about in 10 years a $60 trillion reduction in the amount we plan to spend on this stuff. We'll have the smallest Navy since 1915. We'll have the smallest Army since 1940, but I don't care about the Army so much. And we'll have the smallest Air Force ever, since the Air Force was created out of the Army Air Corps after the Second World War. So this, from a grand strategy point of view, this kind of investment in these kinds of wars, the technical term for it is stupid. It's a stupid thing to do. So the Bush administration kind of sort of losing at least half of its brain on this. Not everybody. Although my boss, Colin Powell, is kind of Army friendly, you know, because he's a 4-star Army general, but never mind. This was not a way to think in terms of long-term stability and effectiveness of American grand strategy. So now where are we? Now we have the Obama administration after the Bush people, and there's still no sign of any kind of serious strategic thinking along the lines of grand strategic thinking along the lines that I've been trying to illustrate. Instead, what we have is a budget pushed, a fiscal pushed way of thinking about this kind of stuff. And we've done it before. We've made national security decisions in the context of serious financial problems. And I'll give you an example, and then you'll see what the result was. Okay, after World War I, the Secretary of State, first of Harding, and then when Harding died, President Coolidge, was a man named Charles Evans Hughes. Now, I'd be willing to bet that the majority of the students in this room have never heard. How many of you have ever even heard of Charles Evans Hughes? One person. And you're probably not even telling the truth. I'm just kidding. Charles Evans Hughes was a remarkable fellow. He was the governor of New York. He ran against Woodrow Wilson in 1916 when Wilson sought re-election and nearly beat Wilson. He was the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. This is pretty good stuff, right? Pretty good pay grade stuff. But in the meantime, he was Harding and Coolidge's Secretary of State. He was quite a brilliant man. What did he do? Most everyone has heard of the Washington Naval Conference of 1922, first modern attempt to create an arms control regime, in this case for capital naval ships. But what people don't know about is that Hughes also set out to clean up the detritus of imperialism in the Pacific after World War I. The Germans had colonies in the Pacific. They had the Mariana Islands, the Marshall Islands, the Farallon Islands, a few other places I won't mention because you don't know where they are anyway, and neither why. And there were extraterritorial rights in China that the Germans had and other European countries had. If you've been to Shanghai, if you've been to the Bund area, you've seen the legacy of some of those European extraterritorial areas in China. Of course, they made some pretty good beer. The Germans made some pretty good beer in China. It's still there. You know, the beer that people in China drink comes from an old German brewery recipe from 1891. That's not important. That's not beer. Marshall tried to clean up this mess after World War I. He did a great job. This is how he did it. The French were involved at the margins. The Russians were there, the Japanese were there, the British were there, and so forth. And this is what he did. He realized that it would not be possible to make a series of bilateral arrangements. And the United States had no possessions except Guam. Not close enough to the Pacific Littoral to make a difference. We were not there. We were not in a position to make a series of bilateral deals with the other powers, especially the British, Japanese. So what he did was he created a bunch of three-way trades. It's like in baseball sometimes. If you want to trade a player, but you can't get the guy you want from the team you want to trade the other guy to, you involve a third team and you do a triple switch. That's what Hughes did. He created a series of layered triple switches to create a new balance in the absence of the German Empire. The British took over most of those islands. The United States took over some of the Marshall Islands. And it was a fairly clever arrangement. And it would have worked. It worked for a while, and it would have worked until along came the Great Depression. And then what did we do? We failed to pay our insurance premiums on this arrangement as the Japanese were expanding and Japanese domestic politics changed toward authoritarianism. And when Pearl Harbor happened, in retrospect, Secretary Stimson, Secretary of War Stimson, and others accused of having sold out the United States to the Japanese. It wasn't true. The arrangement would have worked fine, except again, we didn't pay our way. We didn't pay our insurance premium. We didn't create the assurance military power behind behind those pacts in order to keep them balanced. Don't forget, very important. Everybody knows that military power can, under some circumstances, compel, and everybody knows that under many circumstances it can deter. But what most military power does most of the time is neither compel nor deter, but assure. It reassures. Now, this may not sit well with you to think that the fact that there are American Navy ships sailing around in the Pacific, that this actually has any kind of sort of broad undertone political function, but it does. During the Gulf War, the Second Gulf War, we took both of our carriers out of the Pacific. The Seventh Fleet was basically denuded during the war, and the Chinese discreetly, privately, called us up and said, "When are you sending one of the carrier battle fleets back into the Pacific? We need it. We feel better when it's there." The Chinese free ride on the American supply of a public, essentially a global public security good. That's what the American military does. So when we weren't there, when we were providing no reassurance, okay, all hell broke loose. We got the Pacific War. And of course, the Philippines was a very vulnerable target for the Japanese, again, proving that it was a stupid thing to do to annex the Philippines after the Spanish-American War. Now, so today, we're being driven by financial constraints. We are being, the way things are right now, if the sequestration continues, or even if it doesn't, before the sequestration, there were two large cuts to the defense budget. Defense Budget Act of 2011, and Secretary Gates, in his last years, cut the defense budget quite a lot. It needed to be cut. It was bloated. It had risen too fast and for the wrong reasons. No organization could assimilate all that money wisely in such a short time. It created a huge mess. And because there was too much money floating around, a lot of hard decisions simply didn't have to be made. You could have everything. Right? Now we have to just make some decisions. But now the pendulum has swung so far to the other side that all the things that the Army wants to buy, looking out into the future, just about everything the Navy wants to buy, everything the Air Force can't buy any of them. The point, to wrap this up, is that we can no longer, in a few years it'll be clear that we cannot afford a forward deployment methodology for our anti-hegemonic grand strategy. We simply won't have it. Which is why, by the way, I was sort of disconcerted about the famous pivot to East Asia. You all know the speech that Secretary Clinton gave. We're pivoting to Asia. She gave this big speech. And I thought, gee whiz, we're going to put Marines at Darwin, Australia, okay. We're going to air sea battle, which is a new concept it's basically an Air Force Navy attempt to get more of the defense budget share. That's really what it is. It's not a strategic concept, it's a political concept to get money away from the Army. I'm exaggerating a little. As if the Chinese don't know that we are aware of them, that we're aware of what they're doing. So we pivot with our mouths to Asia at a time when we have the smallest share of Asian GDP in 50 years. Again, when our Army is likely to look smaller than it has since 1940, when the Navy is smaller. I went through this, right? So this is not a very, to me, this is not a very not a very intelligent use of orchestrating words and deeds to say to the Chinese, boy, here we come. Well, you better watch out for us. Oh yeah. It just struck me as kind of an autistic way to talk about these things. But here we are now. We're in a situation where we can no longer afford or implement what we've been doing since 1945-46. We can't do it anymore. There is an alternative grand strategy. Academics talk about it all the time. Academics have promoted it a lot. It's called offshore balancing. We pull back from this basing structure. We pull back our footprint globally. We don't try to suppress security competitions in the world's peripheries. We simply move around our naval forces and use diplomacy to offset or to throw our weight behind various countries when they come into crisis, where our interests are engaged, in order to prevent hegemons from arising in a less direct way. Now, there's a lot that's very appealing about an offshore balancing approach to grand strategy. It's cheaper, at least until it fails. It's cheaper. It requires a great deal more deftness in diplomacy than the forward deployment method. So it's cheaper, but it's more demanding in other ways. The problem with it is that we have a New England problem. We can't get there from here. Can you imagine the amount of diplomatic crockery we'd have to break to get from a forward deployment strategy to an offshore balancing one? So that's where we are right now. And this is a debate that we should be having as a nation. We should be talking about the trade-offs and the difficulties and the transition away from a strategy that has worked for us quite well, that won the Cold War, but that we can no longer afford, or that the country chooses no longer to afford, and an offshore balancing strategy, which looks a little bit like what the British were doing in the 19th century with their Navy. We should be talking about that, but we're not talking about it. We are moving from, by default, we are moving from a forward deployment grant strategy to an offshore balancing strategy without even talking about it. Because our political class, as I mentioned earlier, doesn't have the, has lost the capacity to think and speak in these terms. We've sort of infantilized our thinking about strategic matters. And we're stuck now, again, being pushed by financial pressures into changing the modality of this grant strategy without even talking about it, without even discussing what the trade-offs are. That's where we are right now.